Hello and welcome to yet another exciting session of the Captain's Run. Today we're with Team Buffalo, who have been doing some exciting stuff, of course, as the games have been progressing. I've got the captain with me, Jenna Palmer. Jenna, good to see you. A little bit differently dressed to when I saw you last.
Well, I just thought I'll be a little bit more family friendly for this one, since we have a wider audience.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for being with us. Of course, we've got conservation coaches who are spending time over the weeks with the teams and introducing some interesting stories and facts about conservation. Unfortunately, this week, Ivan Carter cannot be with us, but he has a little piece that he's prepared for us. We are talking about the importance of conservation and the importance of charismatic species or animals in Africa. So we'll have a short video from him in a moment. Before we get there, Luke, I'll just give you an opportunity to introduce the subject today and then maybe just play that video for us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tino, and thanks to all the Buffaloes for being on here. And, you know, Ivan specifically asked me to give you guys all a big thanks from him, and apologies that he can't be here today. He's out in the field. Yeah, he's sent us a little video to introduce the topic, and that'll do most of the work. But charismatic species are basically species that are flamboyant, if you like it, for want of another word, but an animal that has been put out into the public as a flagship for conservation. And there's a bit of controversy around whether a flagship species or charismatic species is using them is the right way to promote conservation, if it really helps conservation, or if it's just focused in on one species. Does it really help the entire habitat? Does it help things like butterflies and beetles that people don't seem to really care about as much? Yeah, I think, I mean, I could go into it, but I'd rather let Ivan do the talking here.
Well, good morning, Buffaloes, and I hope you guys enjoy a really good discussion today. I'm sorry that I can't join you. As you can see, I'm in freezing cold Ermelo. But one of the things I'd love you guys to discuss today is the importance of charismatic species. So a charismatic species is something like a lion, something like an elephant, something like a chimpanzee, something that has charisma as far as the public is concerned. And charismatic species are these animals that people will fund, people will pay money to protect, people will pay money to research, people will pay money to see on a game drive, to hunt. And those are animals that very often for a whole ecosystem are incredibly important, because you don't see a huge Save the Hedgehog fund until a very big campaign about pangolins. Nobody really knew what a pangolin was, but a big effort was made to make them charismatic, and now everybody cares about pangolins. So a charismatic animal truly can be the hero of an ecosystem, because there's no point at all in protecting an individual species if you're not protecting the ecosystem for that species to exist in. So really, when you look at it, a charismatic species can be fantastic for an ecosystem. Something like an elephant, something like a giraffe, something like a lion. You can do lion research, or you can have a lion protection program that protects an entire national park, and with it, all the grasshoppers, butterflies, grasses, everything from the smallest to the tallest. But the other side of a charismatic species is when they get overpopulated, when they require management, that's often with giant public outcry where nobody wants you to touch that animal. So take elephant management, for example. In Botswana, there's lots of areas where there's too many elephants. But because they're such a charismatic species, nobody wants to entertain the idea of culling, of utilizing the protein that could come from that culling to feed starving people, because it's an elephant. It's a charismatic animal, and the general public will not allow that. And so one of the good things with a charismatic animal is the fact that through a charismatic animal, you can protect a whole ecosystem. One of the bad things of a charismatic animal is that public opinion often holds more weight than good foundational science. So you'll get guys that have studied for their entire lives, and they've got a great elephant management plan, but the general public will not allow that management plan to happen because it's a charismatic species. So a couple of questions I'd like you guys to discuss is, what makes an animal a charismatic species? That's the first question. And the second question is, how do you get the general public to think practically and with common sense with regard to managing charismatic species? Well, you guys, hope you have a lively discussion. Hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you for your participation. And one of the most important things we could possibly do as a society, as a human society, which is to conserve our wildlife and conserve our wild areas. And conservation, as you know, the very essence of that word means conserving an entire biodiversity. We can't just conserve one thing. We've got to conserve the entire biodiversity. Otherwise, the one thing can't exist. Have a great day. Enjoy yourselves, and we'll talk to you very soon.
I think the one thing that I picked up, which is really important, we'll talk maybe a little bit about the examples of some charismatic species, but he spoke about it's something that people will pay for to go and see. It's something that people will pay for to make sure it's conserved. So it's certainly of importance to a level where it can sustain an ecosystem by the manner in which it attracts funds to, to conservation. Luke, this is directed at you.
Yeah, Tina, I think that's right. When it comes down to it, it really is about, first of all, who's getting behind the creation of that species as becoming charismatic. For example, what is the intention? What is the goal? Are they using it to further a personal agenda or a company agenda, or trying to drive their own conservation organization, or is it really being done for the greater good? And I think there's a mixture of those types of organizations and players out there. And it's sometimes quite tricky to sift between them, because everything kind of gets just lumped into one big word, conservation. But we've got a few people on this call that have been involved in conservation, and I know, Gino, Krista up in Kenya has got her own foundation. And
thanks, Luke. Yeah, I think I've been lucky enough to run a conservancy or a conservation area on the coastal part of Kenya for nearly 10 years. And we have a flagship species being the elephant. And we have, in Tsavo, there's like 100 strong elephants in a herd. And it's known for it. But I genuinely believe that it's the language that we use. We use the words, hunting and culling, and public perception then of those words is a negative stigma rather than consumptive utilization of wildlife, or something where the words don't necessarily have that negative stigma that the public perception then comes in. We're lucky because the area that we operate in is vast. So, we're frantically protecting the ellies. It's not like your Chobe and places like that where there is necessity of reducing the numbers just because, as we just heard, the biodiversity is and the ecosystem's not able to sustain them. But I do genuinely believe that the language we use has a negative connotation, and the public perception of that then makes conservation more negative, rather than if we use words. I mean, I'm writing my thesis on it, on hunting at the moment, and I use that sort of, that consumption of wildlife, utilization, that kind of element. And I think it doesn't necessarily then have that, oh my gosh, they're going around killing elephants. There's actually strategy to it and reasons for doing it. And it's the explanation and the education that is so important for people's perception. And I think that's where we get it wrong as conservationists. We don't have that conversation.
Krista, you mentioned that you've got a flagship species, which is the elephant, which in itself is a charismatic species. Maybe you can share with us why you've got the elephant as a flagship?
Well, I just think it's what Tsavo was known for. It was known for two flagship species, or your charismatic species, as we're discussing today. So we had the man-eaters of Tsavo, which were the lions, that when they were building the main railways that connected the big cities between Mombasa and Nairobi and beyond, there was a lot of people that were taken by lion out of whilst they were building. So we're known for not the nicest of lions, yeah, but we are known for lions, but also elephant. And I think the reason we have a charismatic species, or a lot of the time where you try and get your USP against other people's USP. So what makes our elephants different? And what makes our elephants different is we have what we call the big tuskers. So we have elephants that have, 100 kilos each tusk. And they drag them on the floor. I mean, they are absolutely phenomenal individuals. And we have a collective of them. And as time goes on, unfortunately, there is an element of poaching that we suffer, and they do tend to come for them. But that is a massive part of what Savo offers. And so whilst we say the elephant, it's always trying to then, what makes Savo better than, Masai Mara? And you try and, once you've got a charismatic species, what can you leverage off of that? And that's what we're trying to work out right now.
Okay, thanks for that. Luke, you want to carry on?
No, I just wanted to point out, first of all, really appreciate having an East African perspective on this call, because how conservation is approached in East Africa is in some ways there's a different approach from governments, from NGOs and from conservation outfits up there to the approach that is in Southern Africa, and neither of the approaches is wrong. It just has Krista has painted quite clearly the reasons why elephants have become sort of a flagship species up there because of the really big tusks. She also pointed out, about the man-eating lions. And if any of you have watched Ghost in the Darkness, you will know the story behind that. It's a really cool movie, one of my favorites. And it's really, really interesting. And yeah, it sort of what you found is that East Africa and the stigma, particularly I think in Kenya, the stigma against hunting is kind of quite powerful, maybe quite similar to what it has been in Botswana, up until maybe the recent years as there's been a change in power there. But of course, there's an argument for hunting in a place like Zimbabwe where it's controlled really well. So that brings a whole lot of other fascinating side to this discussion about the use of hunting and not for hunting. And we've had discussions in the past on these forum, about, is it about hunting? Is it about photographic tourism? Well, actually, at the end of the day, it's about what, those things aren't conservation in themselves. It's what is preserving the habitat and the ecology that counts the most. If we're losing habitat, then we're losing the war in conservation.
Thanks a lot for that, Luke. I think we've understood now, of course, the importance of charismatic species and what they are. I thought maybe moving forward, I can just open up the discussion a little bit, and we can have some examples of what charismatic species are, which animals would be classed as charismatic species, and is it a closed set of animals that we know are set in, or is it somebody can say, well, I feel this should be a charismatic species because of A, B, C, D reasons, and I feel it's a charismatic species. And I think maybe I'll come to Matt first, because I can see that you've got a few charismatic species in front of you.
Thanks. I've got a few more for just now when we do the scene change. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the charismatic species come to the fore because they become threatened or endangered, or there's some controversy around them, which is what brings them to the fore in a lot of cases. So things like perhaps a panda bear, maybe a polar bear, that kind of thing, they become, as soon as they start to get threatened or they're under threat, extinction, that kind of thing, they become a charismatic species. Elephants, I mean, just by their nature, they are charismatic. And I mean, in the areas where they've affected people, and where the controversy is that, like Luke was chatting about, comes up in terms of farmland and invading of where the humans are, where maybe we shouldn't have been in the first place. And now the elephants come in and we have that conflict. So in terms of what defines one, I think there is a pretty, I would say that there is a pretty finite amount of charismatic species, and it's probably to the detriment of some of the others that we need to actually look at. But there's definitely scope to be able to use those charismatic animals as an in to start developing other things. I'm sure Krista has got lots of other projects that run off the back of their elephant conservancy, and it's only because of those animals that they're able to do that. So yeah, it's obviously it's sad in one way that we have to have charismatic species that are under threat, and that's the only reason they come to the fore, like Ivan or whoever it was mentioning about the pangolin. It's an amazing animal, but it's something that's not very well known until we came to this area where we have this issue now. And maybe just one last thing. I mean, in terms of the hunting thing, yes, it's controversial, but I personally think there is scope for it. If it's managed correctly, it can really benefit an area, especially in areas of Africa where it's poor, but they have great wildlife. If it was managed correctly, it's a way of putting back into those communities that don't have anything else, so that they don't get pushed into having to probably kill off their animals or poach or destroy the habitat. They have a means of generating funds other ways. So I do think there is a scope for hunting. And what Krista said was really awesome. Is something I'd never really thought too much about, is obviously your language that you use. You don't call it culling. You've got other ways of getting it across. I think that's actually a really important way that we need to, as conservationists, talk about things like that. Don't call it culling off animals, as she was saying. So yeah, I think that's an important part that we should carry off from this.
You started to touch on something that Ivan has asked us to discuss today as well, in your contribution, which was what makes an animal a charismatic species. So you've touched on a couple of things there, and I think maybe Graham, I'll come to you. Have you got a few points that you feel are ones that contribute to an animal being a charismatic species?
The first one that I think is cautionary is that we need to be sensitive to this being a Western initiative where lots of local tribes and people of Southern Africa have had a form of a charismatic species in their local folklore for a long time. Totem species, for example, some names that come to mind are in Lovu, it's an Ndebele dialect, elephant; Simba for lion; Mofu for eland. And these totems sort of serve in the culture that you don't eat your totem. It's sacred. It's something that you hold dear to your local belief structure. So I think ultimately the indigenous people of Africa and the local people living around these national parks are going to be the custodians of these animals, because they're the ones that live in harmony with them in these buffer zones. So I think the narrative also needs to include the long before us Westerners arrived, there were charismatic species in local tradition. That was the first one. And then the other one I spoke about before was the Disney factor and the charismatic association or the personification of species based on what people are seeing on television.
Yeah.
Which sometimes can come across in a very idealistic or utopian manner, that they think that species lives in absolute harmony and they don't understand or appreciate the changing world we live in, the population dynamics. So back to Matt, I mean, to answer your question, what contributes to it? I think one, it's TV, it's film, it's what the Western world sees and not necessarily understands. But I think in terms of controlling poaching and the illicit trade in wildlife trafficking, etc., you need to win the hearts and minds of the local people, because they are the real custodians. And you can sit in Europe and New York and fund as many anti-poaching or conservation training programs as you want, but if you don't have the buy-in from the people, it's not going to work. And 9 weeks ago, I lost a tractor driver to a lion. He was killed not on duty, but in one of the areas we operate. And I can tell you right now, you can pay me all the money in the world to go and try and convince those people that lion's a totem species and they can't do anything about it. But if you don't go and revenge the death of a person at the hands of a lion, or if you can't appreciate it, we're never going to win the conservation war, because you and I go home and we lock ourselves in a house, we secure, we don't worry about, I mean, the last thing you think about bowling through your door, your window is a lion. But in some of the areas in northern Zimbabwe, that's the reality, and it eats your cattle, it eats your goats, it eats your people. So it's worthless in that context to have a charismatic species when on the front line in the trenches, that animal is seen as destructive and in the worst capacity possible. So I think we just need to be careful on who decides what is a charismatic species, and then what that means for the people that live in harmony with them.
Thanks. Very insightful contribution there, Graham. We've talked about the charismatic species and how important they are. And Graham, you've also just mentioned even in cultural beliefs. does this not cause angering, or have you found it causes angering amongst groups or individuals where some people are protecting or going on about charismatic species, whereas I may favor, for example, the butterfly, which is not a charismatic species, but because it's not, you don't have to come and be up in my face about what is.
Just, reading a couple of things and videos and stuff that Luke has sent, it's been really interesting to, obviously with your charismatic species and it generally being your big five and those ones that are much more known to the public and in the eye. And then you'll get sort of conservancies and ecosystems environments that will focus on those charismatic species and making sure that their survival is of utmost importance, because it's obviously what is funding that ecosystem and is bringing in the tourists, is bringing in the funds for whether it's a corporate or something like that. But in actual fact, species that were thriving there, that ecosystem is now sort of being adjusted to the charismatic. And so you'll get those smaller species, may it be a giraffe population, a zebra, a butterfly, who are now who are not coping so well in that ecosystem because they sort of get forgotten about, and then they end up becoming endangered themselves, which then I suppose you could put the spotlight on them. But it seems to probably from the education side of things, that instead of looking at an entire ecosystem of all the animals that live there, we're tending to focus towards the ones that we are saying charismatic. So probably the smaller subspecies are suffering and becoming endangered themselves.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Captain Jen. I just want to go to another question that Ivan posed for us to discuss today, and maybe Krista or Luke may be in a better position to help us discuss this or get the nitty-gritties of it. How do we get the public to understand the importance of management of these charismatic species? And I think that's a very pertinent question, because we've spoken about what the charismatic species brings in terms of tourists, in terms of funding, is enough to uphold a whole ecosystem of all the animals. So I think that's a very important question. And yeah, maybe we can get some contributions towards that.
Well, maybe I can start off, and maybe it's a bit of a continuation of what Graham was talking about, and some of the stuff which has cropped up on some of the other captains' runs. Essentially, most of the world, if they know about conservation, they fall into the broad group of armchair conservationists. And so they are majorly influenced by what they're seeing on social media, on TV. Graham uses the Lion King. That was kind of maybe the real start of bringing the charismatic species in a big way to the forefront of a worldwide audience. And, sort of everybody wanted to, like, let's save the lion, and we don't like the hyenas, and a little bit dangerous to be going down that narrative, although I love the Lion King and my kids love it, but I'm in a position where I can educate my kids about that. So anyway, leading on to sort of, obviously the problem is also part of the solution, in that most people are not able to have the privilege of accessing these wild areas that are on our doorstep here in Africa. And so we've got to control the narrative. If we let others control the narrative, and we let the Western world and Disney and all of that completely dominate, the wrong messaging gets out there. So I think we've got to work out how to find ways. And again, Graham and I, we've had a couple of discussions about, it's really necessary, as he raised the idea of, like, we've got to make conservation cool. We've got to make it like the thing that everybody wants to be doing, but you've got to have the right message that goes through on that. So charismatic species are really, really important, because something like the Lion King, for example, has got the word out there. People are starting to fall in love with Africa, but maybe falling in love with the wrong idea in some respects. And so, yeah, I think the answer is in making sure that when movies and stuff like that come out, and as we push through social media channels, that we get the right words out. Because someone picks up something, and for example, about, we've all seen what's happened with hunting, and you know, if someone picks up on a really negative story with that, it goes viral very, very quickly. And suddenly now, hunting is completely outlawed, and anyone who's a hunter has kind of almost got like people sending them death threats and stuff like that. Whereas in actual fact, on the ground, it might be a little bit of a different story. So yeah, I think it's a case of controlling the press, the social media, and getting the right, make sure that the right information is getting out there. One
area is, you know, in my time with wilderness in guiding, we had that thing where we try to bring attention away, you know, being on a game drive vehicle when you don't see anything and you think all the animals are run away. We used to come up with these forays into trying to find the little five, and that was like a counter to the big five. And I think the big five was a extension of a hunting term. I guess the first charismatic species were applied in the hunting context of going after the big five in Africa, and that was from literature, from early writings about the pursuit of the hunt. One thing I disagree with is, certainly as guides, safari guides, you the front line, you for every person in the tourism industry, the one person who spends the most amount of time with a visiting foreign tourist, independent traveler, will be the guides at a wilderness, and beyond, wherever it might be. You spend a lot of time on a vehicle with your guests. That is the person who has a responsibility to bring the right message to conservation. And at wilderness, for a long time, we had a policy of you couldn't bring up hunting. You couldn't bring up religion. You couldn't bring up hunting. You couldn't bring up like marriage and sexual equality. Those are like the cardinal sins of hosting a dinner table in a safari camp, due to the sensitivities and the risk that it brought to the reputation of the company. But I challenge that and say that all of our safari guides across Africa, they are the people that are being trusted to look after our visiting market. And we need to start training our frontier guides about the diplomacy and the narrative and how to deliver that narrative. But we can't just not go to those sensitive topics because we don't want to have an awkward conversation on a game drive vehicle when we see an elephant that's swum across the Zambezi with a couple of spear wounds in its side. We can't, you know, it's obvious that there's a problem there. You need to be able to engage that. So, you know, my view to Luke and the Falls community, certainly in Zim, and to everyone else in the non-consumptive photographic industry, is our frontline guides, the people we employ to look after our guests and take them on trips, show them the Africa that they've seen. To comment on Luke's point on the Lion King, the Lion King's done a huge amount for conservation as well. It's a double-edged sword. So my take is we've got to empower our guides, the people we give rifles to, and they walk up onto big game. They are the ones. If you can trust that person out in the wilderness with a buffalo or an elephant, they train, they've done through a lot of years in Zimbabwe. We should certainly trust them to be responsible conveyors of the conservation message. So I think that's the first place. And I kind of challenge Luke in a way that we start that narrative in the safari industry, because people trust your guide. You with someone in the bush for the first time. He's got a rifle. He's walking you up to a herd of elephants. You've got the wind right. You've got cover. If you're going to trust him to walk up to big game, then surely you trust his opinion on conservation. Just a thought, I think, where we can try and get to that message. But it's very sensitive and emotive, and you can't reason with emotion sometimes, with logic. So it's a challenge.
I think Graham's covered most of it there. I just wanted to say, the message that gets sent is the most important thing there. So in Botswana, we've had a lot of controversy with Elephants Without Borders, and I'm sure you've probably all seen some of that in the media and things. And, the worst thing is that social media, half of the stuff you read is fake news anyway. And the real nitty-gritty that you need to hear, you don't actually hear in the end. I think I'm lucky being in Botswana. We kind of eventually do get the true story coming through to us, but it's not after you've been through a lot of layers of things that are not true and things that there's offshoots of it that just go to the wrong thing altogether. I think we were really lucky in that where it kind of stopped is that our president at the time, he was attacked at a conference in the UK. Well, not attacked, but there was a lady that started shouting at him about the elephants and all sorts of things. And he stopped it there, and then he said, I hear you, I understand what you're saying. And I don't know if you saw the clip, but he actually said, I'd like to invite you to come and visit us in Botswana. and see firsthand what is happening there, because what you hear and see is not necessarily what's happening. So that's the kind of example that needs to be set. Easier said than done. I know in some of our other captain's runs, we've talked about legislation and trying to get government to lead the way in some of it. We'd spoken about in terms of the education of people. We spoke a lot about habitat loss, trying to educate the communities that live around those conservancies. But one of the things that came up was educating the little kids, because actually they are the ones that are going to be coming up. They're the next generation of conservationists, and that would hopefully be in a position to make the change. So we're lucky in Botswana that we do have some people at the top saying the right things. Hopefully that continues. I mean, it's not that it's always going to be there, but that's what we also need. That message, as Graham was saying, has to be the same. I think there's definitely scope for, as he said, guides going out there on the front line and saying it like it is and telling them exactly what should and shouldn't be. I know I've got a few friends that are guides in South Africa, and they actually just, I don't think they realize it. They're just wanting to put a video of themselves on Facebook, but they're basically blogging, and they're showing us what's happening every day out in their conservancy. So maybe that's a good thing to see and to encourage moving forward.
I think we've had a pretty decent discussion on charismatic species, their relevance and importance, of course, in African ecosystems. We've had some examples of those. And then obviously this last little bit that we've talked about, which is getting the public to understand the importance of managing those charismatic species, because of course they're so important that so many other things come about with those species.
Tino, can I just add to some of the stuff that everyone's been discussing around around the public perception side? I think the biggest issue I found is the disconnect between people that don't understand the complexity of Africa on the ground, and then of course them wanting to emotionalize what they see on screens. And we basically try and create an emotive story or give charismatic animals specific personalities, and it's almost our own fault for creating that, because we ultimately then make people like or dislike certain species. I've done a fair few projects, some of which, you know, if I need to fundraise to help elephants, it's easy, but I've also got a massive vulture program, and sort of trying to now change the motive of what we were discussing right at the start is really difficult. And so that solution of come on the ground, come and understand, and then each isolated place has its own issues and own complexities, and only when you're on the ground can you actually explain that. But it's really difficult to get Joe Public from some of the Western communities that think they should put the blanket rule of what should conservation be onto areas all over Africa and beyond. And that's where I think that disconnect between what we're creating on screen emotionally to try and embroil people, whilst I know it tugs on the heartstrings and it's very worthwhile, I do also think it's slightly detrimental, because then it gives a perception that then can actually taint certain species rather than actually help them. And I think that ultimately is our problem, because a lot of people who don't necessarily understand it on the ground or the bigger picture, or don't have that view, then get swayed so easily because we believe what's on our screens. And that's where I think it becomes a bit more of a problem for us to manage.
Thank you very much for that, Krista. And of course, you working in conservation for the last 10 years, you obviously get to see that firsthand. So thank you very much for that contribution. Do we have any more from anybody?
I just would like to really add to that, and just to say, you know, totally agree with everything that's been said about, you know, about being able to change the narrative. I think one of the things that's contributed is that sort of the internet age and the speed of internet and the ability to get information out there has kind of reached Africa last. The rest of the world has been a bit ahead, and so they were able to control, particularly the Western world is able to control the narrative. And I agree, like what Graham's saying, you know, that Lion King has done a lot of good, but we now need to take control of what's been done and and make that message right. We're in a position now, we've got decent enough internet, we're able to get out to those who will always, unfortunately, remain armchair conservationists. We simply can't get everybody out to Africa. They can't afford to come here. And there's lots of communities who will unfortunately never visit this continent. So why should they care? We've got to appeal to them. We've got to appeal to that mass market that actually can't get here. And we've got to get into their lounges, into their living rooms, into their heads, and make them understand that conservation is really important and protecting wildlife habitats are really important. So whether we're doing that through putting a guide at the forefront, and I think that's a brilliant way of doing it, because they're sort of like, they're like the sports people that are on here. They are the sports people of conservation, the sports people of the wild, the people that everyone looks up to. And I think their status is just going to grow as people start to understand conservation more.
Right. Thank you very much, Luke. I think, Team Buffalo, that will be it for this week. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking time out to be on this week's Captain's Run. I thought we've done very well for ourselves, of course, without Ivan Carter being with us. But thanks to Ivan anyway for his video and just setting up the discussion that we had on charismatic species today. I've certainly come away from this a little bit more educated on that side. But everybody, thank you very much for your contributions. To those of you that haven't had any games yet, all the best for those. Jenna, I know you are looking forward to climbing up the ladder over the next few days. But otherwise, guys, thanks a lot. And until the next time, all the best and be well.
Our wildlife needs help. Tourism to Africa is at an all-time low. You can assist by liking and sharing the conservation games. You can contribute financially by hitting the donate button on the Zambezia.com website. Let's get together and back up the frontline conservation team.